Welcome to Academic, a space for thoughtful conversation between two scholars. No headlines, no sound bites, just an exchange of ideas.
You mentioned yesterday that the thing that brought you into researching hell started with science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And what you were reading in the science fiction world. Can you talk a little bit about the parallels between, or what you saw in this emerging time when you were first looking at this material? And can you speak about some of the connections that existed between science fiction and what you're perceiving as hell or afterlife literature?
Actually, I'm going to step it back just a bit to one of my earliest memories. Is waking up being terrified of the idea of infinity. So from about the age of 5, there was this preoccupation with this unseen world and time, space. Then I spent years as a student and was coming close to the end of my PhD. I had done all my exams and I was looking for a topic and I wanted to edit a text. As I was searching for a text, I was reading a lot of science fiction and had gone through all of these works about heroes and strange landscapes, fighting demons and devils. And all of a sudden, I came upon this vision of Tyndale, which was a 12th century vision of the afterlife. And it just totally resonated because here is the story of this young Irish knight who is a bit of a ne'er-do-well. And he has an attack one day at dinner. It's a really interesting story because he's at dinner. He goes with his friends. He demands repayment for some horses that were bought from him. And the friend says, well, I actually don't have the money for it now. And he gets furious. He finally calms down, and then he has an apoplectic fit. And he's lying on the ground, and everyone thinks he's dead, except he's got a little warm spot. And they say, well, we won't bury him yet. And what happens is he goes on this 3-day journey to the other world. And it is exactly like these hero stories of descent into the underworld, meeting dragons, meeting monsters. And eventually he comes out and he's a changed man. He becomes a pilgrim. And it was just fascinating. So it's a quite long vision of heaven and hell for the period. I always contended it's the most important vision of heaven and hell before Dante.
And this is an 12th century Irish text.
Yes.
So how I've always sort of read your work is, in this sort of matrilineal line that goes from Walker Bynum and Carol Christ and these sort of female engagements with the Middle Ages, which are very nuanced and very interesting. And what I want to know, so there's a two-part question to that. So on the one hand, what do you think is the most important thing that people today could understand about the medieval conception of hell, particularly its difference? And secondly, following in this sort of history of female engagement, female scholarly engagement with a lot of this material, can you speculate at all about why that may appeal to a lot of female scholars, and particularly in medieval studies, which had a sort of conservative bent? Mm-hmm. But you had all these sort of female titans who brought in all this information. So I know that doesn't probably follow, that doesn't cue straight. But if you could answer both of those.
Well, I'm very happy to be put in a class with those scholars.
I thought you would.
Yes, it's a great compliment. One thing that's interesting about the choice of topic, so I never actually intended to be an academic. Mm-hmm. I was doing a doctoral dissertation, but was really interested in going into publishing. So I think that freed me from choosing a more conservative topic. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, my dissertation director wanted me to work on Richard Rolla. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh, God save me. So I just went on with this vision of heaven and hell without concern for career possibilities. Mm-hmm. as a result of that. So it is possible that there's a kind of renegade spirit in choosing those kinds of topics. And as far as it's resonating in the modern world, I don't know very much about belief in the other world in this era. Apparently, Americans believe in it much more than Europeans in general, and more than most people in general. So it probably has some resonance, and I am occasionally contacted by people who have a very strong belief in these things, and I try to actually disengage, because I really think of it as a literature, a fantasy literature, one with really strong basis in obviously the theology and the religious life of the time, but very different from the way the theologians are dealing with it and the philosophers.
It's that latter point, I think, that is so interesting. And maybe we can speak about this is, you know, when you think about hell was a preoccupation in the medieval period. People were imagining it. Dante was imagining it. You had all of these people who were sort of meditating on this possibilities of torture. And you have an incredibly violent society at the time. And people are thinking about these things and choosing to think about these things in their private lives. And I think for many of us today, that's very confusing. You know, why would it that, you know, you could sit down and you could think about the saints or anything else, but for a lot of people, tremendous public appeal was hell and the literatures of suffering and imagining these things. So in your mind, what sort of... You wrote that wonderful article called What Every Medievalist Should Know About Hell. And top 10, I love that. But if you could sort of speculate about that mindset, how do we get into how can we put ourselves in a state to understand why this would be a popular literature?
It's interesting that it becomes a popular literature because, in fact, you know, most of these texts were written in the monastery. And they were written to sort of orient the other monks toward their religious life. They're told as very interesting stories. Obviously, a lot of the monks are not terribly well educated. And so they respond to this kind of a literature. A lot of the decoration that we have is actually monastic decoration. It's from convents, and I mean, it does show up in churches and cathedrals, but a lot of the examples are monastic and convents from the period. So knowing that the origins are in that world, where the monks obviously are asked to concentrate on the things of the other world, I think you can understand why this generated itself and perpetuated itself. So these texts were written, they were shared, they were sent around in letters from one monastery to another so that people could share these fabulous stories. They were included in chronicles as sort of the wonders of the time. So you'd have, along with eclipses and volcanic eruptions, they would list these people who had visions of the other world. What happens, interestingly, especially with this vision of Tyndale, it's translated into something like 13 different languages. And the number of manuscripts is just really astounding. I once started to keep a catalog of manuscripts, and I eventually gave up because I didn't have that much time to do it. It's translated, so it's written in Latin by an Irish monk who's in Regensburg. Eventually, in the 15th century, it comes back to the British Isles, and it's translated into English, into Middle English, but it's translated as a heroic poem. So this thing that was a religious text is all of a sudden rewritten, emphasizing all the exciting parts of it, poetry, illustrated manuscripts. So it becomes this basically like a chanson de geste. This exciting story it becomes.
So it starts in this very sort of highly theological, you're making actual statements about the beyond, and then it comes back as a romance, as a form of popular entertainment. That in itself, I think, is very telling, because, I just don't feel like we can understand the type of theological saturation that was the Middle Ages, and these preoccupations that were. I really don't even think that we have a good way of talking about them, and maybe you can speak to this, because we tend to think about religion from years and years and years of anthropological theory as that which is set aside, of utmost importance, etc. That's Tillich's definition. But when you look in the Middle Ages, there's a much more, I think, robust, humane view of religion. Where you have people, it's not just something that you discuss in a church. It's something that, it's a phantasmagoria that you live in your entire life. People report seeing demons, etc. And I think that, that's why this literature is so strange to us today, because at least in my understanding, when you're trying to read through these things, I kept thinking, who was this written for? And when you realize, as you were saying, that this, it starts in one context and reaches in another, but that shows this very it's a very shady distinction, because really these bled into one another, and they continued well into, as you say, until the 17th century certainly. You know how there's always these reading guides. When you pick up a book, it's like, keep this in mind. If there's something that you could, like a golden rule, that you could present to say, well, keep this in mind when you're reading this, I think this might be really helpful. If it's sort of this overarching idea to keep in mind when you're looking at these texts.
I think that I would have to say that these texts are written, they're not actual reports of what people experienced.
Okay.
They're very much conditioned by the community that surrounds them. So the religious community, the civic community. And I think you would have to look at them in the same way that now you would look at zombie literature. That it's something fantastic. And what is the mentality that's creating, what's the context that's creating this kind of or forming this kind of story, forming this sort of narrative, so that in the Middle Ages, whatever it was that was preoccupying people, it comes out in this way, because it's a literature that they're familiar with. They hear these stories. They're probably included in sermons. They're included in pictures so people can relate to them. And now I don't think people can relate to them quite in the same way. But people can relate to Lord of the Rings is the perfect example, right? Because it is the same sort of story of this battle in this inhospitable landscape against all of these forces of evil. So it's this, it is the same narrative of, good versus evil, the hero versus the forces of
darkness.
Darkness, yes.
And it's really interesting because I've got to bring in Tolkien, because Tolkien was a medievalist.
He was, yes. It's a disease among us.
Who spent his life trying to understand these.
I always think of Dante as being the last point in this literature. Okay. After that, it shifts entirely. But in fact, I think it's also with Dante that it shifts, because I would say all of the reports of these visions are based on some sort of experience of a person. Dante, I think, is experiencing something, but I think his work is an entirely literary invention. I don't think that he has that other world experience. I think he's really a literary and political man who's using this form to explain his place in the world, in the political world, and in the religious world at the time. And I think with Dante, you can already see the end of this tradition. I know that there are works after that. They're not quite in the same vein. There's a shift there. I think it's probably based on changing beliefs. I think it's probably based on, as you get later, certainly the influence of Neoplatonism. I think the influence of new knowledge about the universe, so that it's no longer, people no longer have this conception of devils under the earth. I mean, I think we probably could be convinced about it now, but I think at that period, I think a lot of the people who are in religious orders, their minds are turning in different directions. And this kind of, it is very medieval, these visions of heaven and hell, and it stops. It essentially stops. By the 1400s, it's just an antiquarian kind of thing, from my point of view.
But the entire, emphasis, so how we start with this idea that you go into the depths of the earth to meet the gods. This is a very important part of Greek religion, that inside the bowels of the earth, you meet deities. You find dreams, you find explanations. When we have the Christian period, and when you start seeing this direction, the sort of land of the underworld becomes Christianized to be a place of devils and demons. And it's a place of terror and something that you should fear. And then we start seeing this again. It's this ripple effect where at moments you sacralize the underground and then you fear it. And I think that it speaks to something very, this very human primal concern, and the way that we handle these primal concerns by either sacralizing or condemning. And I wanted to ask you about that element.
What happens is, so hell becomes this place of punishment, eternal punishment. And then you get, around the 12th century, this change where purgatory kind of creeps in. So there are these visions where you think the person is in hell, but then they find out that they're not in hell because, like, the first 7 layers that they've gone through, those people all are actually being punished and purged. And they will eventually leave that space and go to heaven. Purgatory eventually becomes a separate place, but for probably about 200 years, purgatory and hell are the same place. And then there is, in this place, not only the damnation, but also the possibility of redemption.
This becomes part, in the Renaissance, of a revival of people wanting this experience, but in a much less personally responsible way. This is something, so in the 17th century and 18th century, you have ornamental hermits who are people hired to sit in, it's one of my research topics.
Yes.
They're cosplaying real hermits.
Yeah.
For seemingly, I mean, this is very often it's in Protestant context, so you don't actually know anchorite or religious hermits at all, but it's the memory and this image, and the people in the Georgian period wanted to cultivate that as something to do. And you were talking about this purgation experience in the Hortus Palentinus, which was this famous garden that was built for Friedrich V and his wife Elizabeth Stuart. He included this Wunderkammer that was a artificial grotto that ostensibly would be so he could go down and think on his sins and work things out for himself and then return to the world of the living. So I think that when I was asking earlier, what is something that people today would need to understand in order to read this literature, is that we have this purgation ideas, and that that distinction that you talk about is actually really enlightening, because if you believe, as you said, that this is a temporary state that one can arise from, that would make the thinking about it very beneficial potentially for the soul.
Yes, yes. So I'm going to turn tables on you.
Okay.
And I'd like to know about Swedenborg, because I actually don't know anything about his heaven and hell. Is it based on a vision?
I would say that Swedenborg's ideas about heaven and hell are the reason that, through popular dissemination, are the reason why the more medieval approach to a lot of these things no longer work. So that's a very bold claim. Emanuel Swedenborg in 1749 receives a vision from the Lord, Jesus Christ, who appears to him and actually tells him, says, "Stop eating so much." That's the first, that's the first recorded vision he has, is stop eating. You're eating too much. But that was the beginning of over 50 years' experience in the spiritual world. And unlike other mystical writers who often talk about the ineffability or the inexpressibility of the afterworld, Swedenborg is completely the opposite. He's, as a scientist, going flat Latin, the most flat descriptions of wonderful things.
Wow.
And that is, so he goes to heaven and he goes to hell. And he comes up with in a certain sense, he works out a lot of these punishment theories, but in the guise of a completely different Christology, where Jesus is literally the embodiment of Father, Son, and Spirit, and you have a humanization on the element of the highest levels of the Godhead. And that would naturally recast all of the spiritual experiences in the next world. So Swedenborg talks about what we are most attracted to, that is our love, that is actually the essence of our being. And in the next world is essentially a reflection of our inner world here. If you live a heavenly life here, you will live a heavenly life in the next world. And there's actually one of the great attractions for me is there's no escape from that. There's no instantaneous forgiveness. You have to cultivate this over a long period of time. But the interesting thing is, even in the next world, so people who have a negative sort of mind state, and they're drawn to the hells. And I think that there's nothing more true in terms of psychology, because Freud talked about the repetition complex, that we have a tendency to want to punish ourselves again and again. And Swedenborg talks about this as a form of hell. And this is, of course, much later, but C.S. Lewis talks about hell being a door locked from the inside. That hell is not something that you escape because it is a literal mind state that you have created, and that's what you desire. You desire the wickedness, and you're actually terrified by anything else. And that to me seemed so true. But it was completely different than any of these other experiences. You had an 18th century Titan, a man who was versed in all the sciences. And he starts having experiences like you're describing, he presents them actually in a very systematic way, but we know from his dream journal, for instance, that wasn't always how they came out. And very often he would have terrifying experiences, and then he would wait several days, and then he was informed about the meaning of them. So it's a very strange body of literature, and it's the largest single theological writing. He's over 100,000 pages written. But that sort of view, so that was published in Heaven and Hell, his most famous work, and that becomes an influence in Romanticism. It's right in this time where we start seeing pietism in terms of Methodism in Britain. So it has this very widespread appeal to a lot of people who are thinking about the afterlife, and they're really wondering. And that point you're bringing up about purgatory is very interesting. But I think that particularly in the Protestant idea, it's you've got heaven or you've got hell. And I think that without that mediation of saints, without all this sort of vision of the church as a mediary function, Swedenborg's ideas become much more centralized, even though to most people they've never heard his name. Dante has a sort of, you do this, you receive this punishment. But a lot of these experiences I don't feel like have that direct correlation. People suffer, and there doesn't necessarily, other than you know that they're sinners and cast out and did something very evil, but there doesn't seem to be there's not a why as much. That's not much of a concern. Do you find that?
Well, it does develop. At first, it's just sort of this huge pit, and everyone is thrown in together. But it does become segmented. So when Dante picks it up, it's also already kind of a well-established thing. You'll find it associated with the 7 deadly sins, and each of the levels has a different type of punishment for a specific type of sin, which is, and you see this sometimes illustrated in, I think, especially Italian churches, where there's separate caves, and they even have little labels on them. Say, these are where the gluttons are punished, and these are where the greedy are punished. And the greedy in particular, they have molten gold thrown down their throats. So that's a specific punishment for a specific sin. But you also made an interesting point that I wanted to come back to about Tertullian, 4th century. He says that there is no fire in hell, that you bring your own fire with you.
Oh, yes.
It's sort of a self-generating punishment, so similar to
Swedenborg.
Yes, and C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Where you're responsible for you basically bring your own punishment with you. And it's interesting. I wonder if, in fact, daily life in the Middle Ages, we always try to figure out how really bad it was. And it doesn't seem to me to have been so bad, but maybe that's because we're living in the 21st century.
I feel like the great dangers of particularly research into the medieval world is because this was a period where people were less aware of their own textual production.
And there's so much we don't really know about it. I mean, we can study all of these texts, and yet we still don't understand really completely what it was like.
No.
I think you get the sense that everybody sort of knew their place and felt a part of a structure in the Middle Ages, and yet, you're always hearing about the people on the outside too. So it's hard to know exactly. Well, it's really hard to understand another era. Sometimes it's hard to understand our own.
Yes, I think that this overview has been very, very helpful. It has been sort of meandering, but that's also sort of the response to the afterlife in a lot of ways.
Meandering through scenarios, yes.
You just go around and hopefully you get somewhere. You just sort of have to jump in there.
Oh, I think so, yes.
You just have to start reading.
And if you're attracted to something, that's what's going to occupy your mind. You just have to pursue it.
Yeah. And to jump back to the very first point that I brought up here, which it had never clicked to me until you said that when you were talking about your career trajectory. When you look at Walker Bynum, Carol Christ, etc., these very prominent female figures, as you were saying, many of them did not feel that they would have a place in the academy. I don't think Walker Bynum ever did. And that gave her a certain amount of freedom to address these other things. And I think that is why you started seeing so many female scholars in the early part of the 20th century who were looking at this material, because it was interesting, it was important, but it wasn't automatically recognized as such, and especially in the early 20th century when all they were interested in was poems and all this other stuff.
Yes, bishops.
And I think that, to continue that legacy is very, very important. And thank you for all the work you're doing at Bristol.
Oh, thank you very much.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.